I think we'll get started with our program tonight. I'm Joe Calvarusa, the Executive Director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation. And Elaine Didier, the Executive Director of the Gerald R. Ford Museum, we asked Gleaves if we could say a few words. Gleaves is always so generous of thanking us for our wonderful partnership, and Elaine and myself wanted to thank Gleaves and the Hauenstein Center in Grand Valley for all the wonderful things we can do together, and to be able to bring speakers today that we couldn't do individually. We can do things as a group. So we wanted to thank you, Gleaves, the Hauenstein Center, for all you're doing for the university and for Grand Rapids. So let's give them a round of applause. With no further ado, Gleaves does not need any introduction. Come on up here. Gleaves Whitney, thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Well, I tell you, for partnerships to work, let me return the compliment. There are a number of people from the Ford Foundation and Library and Museum here, and we are really proud of this partnership because you see you guys are in a love fest. You didn't know you'd be coming to that, but really, the institutions that come together to make great things happen are very important. We have Don Lubbers, President Emeritus of this university, who had a vision about what a presidential studies center could be, complementing what the Ford Library and Museum and Foundation are doing. And so that partnership over the last 14 years has borne a lot of fruit. It's what makes this evening's program possible. You get all this, that overused word synergy, but you do get all the ideas and resources to bring in first-rate speakers. And we just have a great platform for doing those things. But for me, it goes back to this guy, Ralph Hauenstein. Now, yes, give him a hand. Give him a hand. Ralph may have left us 13 months ago, but he continues to cast a long influence over everything we do. I call Ralph our North Star. Bill Brands and I were just standing in the back of this room a few minutes ago. Bill looked at this and he said, this guy looks like he's out of Central Casting. He really does. A lot of people say he looks like Charlton Heston. I would agree. But it's the lasting moral impact, the intellectual impact that Ralph had in the formation of this center, his dedication to leadership, his seeing with his own eyes the evil of the 20th century and being determined, as John Wardrop has said so many times, being determined in the 21st century to do what he could to make sure the very best in our leadership would be cultivated. So Ralph has done his part, and it's up to us to continue that great legacy. And so when we partner with an organization called the Ford, and the integrity that president had, our 37th president had tremendous, or 38th president had tremendous integrity. And so we are so proud to have that kind of association. Just want to say something in this climate opinion. A lot of people ask, and I'm sure questions will come to Bill as well tonight, about the current state of politics and where our country is right now. I'm always quick to say that I think that the time that we are in is going to see a tremendous strengthening of American institutions. Now, those of us who teach are impressed by the fact that now the American people are talking about things like Rule 19 in the Senate or the Emoluments Clause of the Constitution. We are getting lessons in what this republic stands for and is about. And I see a strengthening of our institutions. And I think these institutions will weather whatever storms are happening on both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue and in the Supreme Court and out in the state. So at the Hauenstein Center, we're bullish about this experiment in ordered freedom called the United States. And we're going to continue to bring in speakers, such as the one you're going to hear in a few minutes, who can tell our story in a compelling way, in a way that we get and are proud of, and help the rising generation understand what we're about. And And speaking of the rising generation, we have somebody from our Cook Leadership Academy. A dear friend of Ralph Hauenstein was Peter Cook. And Peter Cook, his name is very important to us. It's the name of our Leadership Academy at the Hauenstein Center. And I would like to invite Michaela Cole to come up and speak. Michaela?
Hello, my name is Michaela Cole. I study political science, and I am a second-year fellow of the Cook Leadership Academy. I was drawn to the Cook Leadership Academy because I wanted to approach leadership in a deliberate way. Rather than thinking of leadership as a quality one either possesses or does not, the Academy works with fellows to nurture and grow our leadership skills as part of a continual process. The Academy's commitment to fostering leadership excellence and Hauenstein Center events like this one have also helped me realize that common ground is possible. Interacting with a diverse group of students and community members with a wide range of perspectives has made me a more empathetic leader. As someone with plans to work in the political arena one day, I hope to use what I've learned here to become a change maker and reach across the aisle and across the globe to create a better, brighter future. My name is Michaela Cole, and I'm a leader. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Michaela. My name is Scott St. Louis, and I am the Program Manager for the Common Ground Initiative here in the Hauenstein Center. For many of you, our guest this evening is already a familiar face, so for the sake of giving Professor Brands as much time with you as possible this evening, I will keep my remarks as short as his distinguished record will allow. Professor Brands is the author of 30 books, 2 of which have been finalists for the Pulitzer Prize. His writings have also appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, the Chicago Tribune, the Atlantic, the Journal of American History, and trust me, many, many other places. In addition to his prolific energies and distinctive style on the page, Professor Brands is also one of the most gifted lecturers and conversationalists and teachers working in the American historical profession today. He's made appearances on a number of national television programs, radio networks, and documentaries. Currently, Professor Brands is the Jack S. Blanton Senior Chair in History at the University of Texas, Austin. His teaching experience also extends to Vanderbilt University, Texas A&M, and our very own Hauenstein Center, where he's been one of our favorite guests for a number of years now. Please help welcome Professor Brands back to Grand Rapids.
Thank you, Scott, for that very kind introduction. Can you all hear me okay in the back? Loud enough? Very good. I want to thank Gleaves and the Hauenstein Center and the Ford Museum and Foundation for making this visit possible. I'm not sure which number visit this is. It's a dozen or 14. So? 14. Well, it is a treat for me to come each time that I do because I get to renew acquaintances with old friends and to meet new people, and I get to admire yet again the wonderful work that Gleaves Whitney has done with the Hauenstein Center to make it a center both of historical scholarship and of civic engagement, to train scholars, students of history, but also to engage students and the broader public with important affairs of public life. And to me, this is sort of a model of what higher education can do. And so, Gleaves, keep doing what you're doing. It's wonderful stuff. And keep inviting me back. I'm going to talk this evening about a story that unfolds in 3 parts. And it's a story that is, well, it's related to this book that I wrote that was published in the fall. And the story is about 2 men who dominated American public life during, well, right at the midpoint of the 20th century. 2 men who polarized political opinion, who scared the daylights out of the world at one particular point, and who perhaps took the United States and the world closer to nuclear disaster than it has ever been at any other time. But the story unfolds in 3 parts. And the first part is the story as it emerged in real time. The crisis, the critical moment occurs between the very end of 1950 and the beginning of 1951. So it really is right at the midpoint of the century. Now, without prying into anybody's personal life or your own age, does anybody care to volunteer that you remember the Korean War? Are there any Korean War veterans in the room? Okay. I ask because there is a particular challenge in writing the history that some of your readers have lived through. And the first challenge is trying to get it right. knowing that there are people out there who can say, well, no, I was there. That's not the way it happened. But actually, the larger challenge is a challenge that I have encountered in one or two other books that I've written, and that is write about history that I lived through. I didn't live through the Korean War. I was born in 1953. So in fact, I was born about 2 weeks after the armistice that ended the war in the summer of 1953. And so I have no living memory of the events that I describe. I do have living memory of other things that I've written about. The book that came out before this one was a biography of Ronald Reagan. And in fact, last time I was here, I was speaking about the book. And I think one of the points that I made then, and it's worth reiterating, is that there are particular challenges to writing about events that you have lived through. Because there's a temptation to think that because you lived through them, you are an expert on them. And you are. You're an expert, and I speak now to those of you who lived through the Korean War. You are an expert on certain parts of the Korean War. If you were in theater at the time, then you were an expert. You know what it was like to be there. If you were living in the United States at the time this controversy erupted between President Harry Truman and General Douglas MacArthur, then you will have some recollections of what it was like to be alive. On this subject, so I asked how many of you were alive during this time, how many of you can remember where you were when you heard the news that Harry Truman had fired Douglas MacArthur? Anybody remember this? Okay. And the reason I ask this is that, and this is not to say that those of you who were all alive during this time should remember that, because there are certain moments with each generation that etch themselves on the memory of that generation. It usually has to do with where exactly you are in your life. I wrote a book about Franklin Roosevelt, and I asked my mother and my father, now both deceased, if they remembered where they were when they heard that Franklin Roosevelt died. And my mother did. My mother did. She was in college in California at the time. And so she remembered exactly where she was. She was walking back from getting an ice cream cone on this particular day when she either heard it on the radio or heard something. My father says he did not remember where he was when he got the news. Now, my father was in the Army during World War II. But it's not that he was sort of busier than my mom, but that my mother was of an age, she was 12 years younger than my father. And so Franklin Roosevelt was the only president she could remember. And so this was a huge thing. My father remembered other presidents, and presidents come and go and they die and other stuff like that. So the reason I ask is that you can tell sort of where you were in your maybe upbringing and your exposure to public events. Anyway, I didn't know anything about the story of the events in the book. So it's about the Korean War. It's about Harry Truman, Douglas MacArthur, and the intersection of their public lives and careers in the middle of the Korean War. And so I wasn't alive to learn about it, but as I grew up in the 1950s and early 1960s, I was aware of who these two men were. And I knew that Douglas MacArthur was this celebrated general, but he wasn't celebrated in the way that Dwight Eisenhower was celebrated. Dwight Eisenhower is the first president I remember. And I had this notion that, okay, they were these two guys who were famous from World War II, but one of them became president and one of them didn't. And I really didn't have any knowledge of other generals from World War II. There certainly were other generals, but these were the ones that just sort of stood out. One was president, and the other one was the most, as it turned out, and I didn't realize at the time, but was the most sort of theatric of the generals. And so George Marshall, okay, I mean, he was very important, but he was a quiet kind of guy, not like MacArthur. And Harry Truman was still around in the 50s and early 60s, and he would surface occasionally, but he was one who, boy, he seemed to walk under a cloud because he had been president, but nobody wanted to talk about him, and the Democrats wouldn't own him, and the Republicans didn't want anything to do with him either. The Republicans, of course, because of the other party, and he was one who was the heir to Franklin Roosevelt at the time the Republicans were running in the other direction. And the Democrats, well, I didn't really know this at the time, I learned about it later, that, well, he was, as it turns out, the most unpopular president in American history. His approval rating, I guess maybe I should call this disapproval rating, his approval rating at the time he left office was 22%. This is the lowest ever recorded for any president, even Richard Nixon, in the depths of Watergate. He only hit 24%. So this is Harry Truman. And as I got a little bit older into the 1960s, occasionally Harry Truman would resurface. But it was usually in the context of his saying something kind of outrageous. Something that was maybe earthier or a little bit more off color than you associate with former presidents. And it was so Harry Truman has said this other crazy thing or this other outrageous thing. And that was sort of it. And that's about what I knew of the Korean War. And again, for my generation, Korea was not the war that we grew up with. The war that we grew up with was the Vietnam War. And so that's the war that I knew. And now I had heard about World War II. My father was in the Army during World War II, and the fathers of friends were World War II vets. And that was the war Americans liked to remember. Korea was a war that Americans didn't like to remember. And I didn't know exactly why, because again, I was just a kid, and I didn't understand that it was a war that was this first limited war that the United States had fought in the era of the Cold War, and it ended very unsatisfactorily. And again, there was this big controversy in the middle of it. So this was my fuzzy knowledge of the Korean War and of these two protagonists. So there it is. I go off to college and I do a few other things, and eventually I find my way to history graduate school in the early 1980s. Now this is about 30 years after the events of the early 1950s. 30 years is significant in American history, more precisely in the history of American events relating to national security, because the documentation, the historical documentation, the raw material that historians work with, the kind of stuff you see at the Ford Library and at the other presidential libraries, they generally, when they deal with national security stuff, they're mostly always classified initially. And so they're confidential or secret or top secret. And if you were to go to the Obama Library when it opens in Chicago in a couple of years or a few years, whenever it opens, and you want to see what the National Security Council was talking about, what was going on in the Situation Room of the Obama White House on the night that Osama bin Laden was killed, you're not going to find it. You're going to go there, and there will be documentation saying there was this meeting, they talked about this, but you don't get to read it because it's classified. You have to wait for a while. How long do you have to wait? Well, typically around 30 years. So I'm in graduate school at the University of Texas in 1981. That's when I began. And I can remember in my first semester, I took a course, a research seminar on American foreign policy. And I went to graduate school thinking I was going to study the Cold War. So I signed up for this research seminar, and I decided that I was going to do a seminar paper on U.S.-British relations in the early Cold War, partly because I figured out a way to double dip. I was taking a course in American foreign policy and a course in British imperial history. And I could work the two together. And so I did. And this was a sweet spot for doing this kind of research, because the British have a pretty clear-cut 30-year rule, and their historical documentation becomes available after 30 years. In the US, it's a little bit less clear-cut, but especially then, it was pretty predictable that by 30 years after the fact, you could have nearly all of the high-level stuff that you needed to see to write a history of decision-making in the Truman administration, let's say. So I started in on this project, and I'm writing about, the various issues that emerged between the United States and Britain in the period from about 1948 to the early 1950s. And I'm following what the British government, then headed by Prime Minister Clement Attlee, was up to, and what it wanted out of its relationship with the United States, and how it dealt with issues regarding Europe and the Marshall Plan and China. The British had Hong Kong as a colony, and when the Chinese communists took control of China, what did that mean for Hong Kong? Attitudes toward India, which had just become independent, and how was the United States dealing with that, and how was Britain doing with that, and all this other stuff. And as one part of the story, I came across a summit meeting between Clement Attlee, the British Prime Minister, and Harry Truman, the American President. But it was very much unlike other summit meetings that I had heard about or read about. Summit meetings are usually planned months in advance because you have to organize the agenda, and you have to handle the security, and you have to make sure that everybody in government is on board with what you're doing and all of this. This was a summit conference that took place almost at a moment's notice. It was it was an emergency summit conference. It was a crisis summit conference. And it turned out that it was prompted by something that Harry Truman said at a press conference. And the thing that Harry Truman said was, now, the Korean War was not really what I was studying. It was part of the story, but that's not the thing that I was centrally studying. But of course, it was front and center in what Harry Truman was doing, and what Clement Attlee was doing as well, because the British were participating. They had sent troops to go in with the UN coalition. And what Harry Truman said at this press conference at the end of November 1950 was that the United States was considering using the atom bomb in Korea. And I sort of had to go back and figure out, so why is he threatening to use the atom bomb in Korea, and how is this coming about? But I did know, and so this, I filled that part in, and I did know that this created a huge uproar in British politics. In fact, Clement Attlee was engaged in what they call question time in British Parliament, where the Prime Minister has to stand up and answer questions from various members of the House of Commons. And when the news came from the United States that Harry Truman had threatened to use the atom bomb in Korea, there was a near mutiny within Attlee's own party, the Labour Party, the more left of the two parties. The party that was more skeptical of the United States than the conservative, the Tory party was. And Attlee, he sort of heard from the rumblings in the back benches about this, and he learned what was going on, that the President of the United States not only had threatened to use the atom bomb in Korea, but that the decision on whether and when the bomb would be used lay not with the President of the United States, but with the field commander, Douglas MacArthur. And when these Labour MPs got this news that Douglas MacArthur had his hand on the nuclear trigger, that is what just set them off. And so in order to calm the House, Attlee, on the spur of the moment, had to say, I will go to Washington. Now, generally speaking, you don't get to invite yourself to summits for state visits. But Attlee could, and Truman, understanding the sensitivity of the moment, agreed. And so there was this emergency summit meeting, at which Harry Truman had to walk back what he had said about the atom bomb. But before he did, there was this crisis that just rolled around the world, because it was the first crisis of the nuclear age. It was the first one where it appeared as though there might be a nuclear war. Not just one side using the atom bomb against Japan. That was World War II. But the first major conflict in which both sides had nuclear weapons. And so I thought, this bears looking into. And I could, in fact, find, as I say, most of the sources available to find out what was going through the heads of the various principals. And for this, and because I was located in the United States, and I didn't have a chance that semester to go to London to look at the records in the British Public Record Office, I focused on the American side. Now, the American side, this is a technical matter, but it was very important for this. In the 1860s, the U.S. State Department initiated a tradition to which scholars of this country's foreign policy, journalists, anybody interested, is even today indebted. And it was the practice of publishing, putting out there in public view, the important documentation on American foreign policy. The series is called Foreign Relations of the United States. And when it began in the 1860s, all the stuff that was of interest in 1863 was published in one volume, like this. And these are mostly public documents and treaties and the like. By the time you get to the mid-20th century, 1 year takes not one volume, but a bookshelf. And by the time you get to now, they're up to they've fallen behind the 30-year rules, so now they're up to the 1970s. And it expands because the scope of American foreign policy expands. But I was able to look in these published volumes and see what Harry Truman was saying to Douglas MacArthur, the cables that were going back and forth, what the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Omar Bradley, was saying to the Secretary of Defense, George Marshall, what they were saying to Clement Attlee, the British Prime Minister, and to put the story together. And it was a story that grew more fascinating the closer I got to it. Because it was a story that told of these two very powerful personalities who had fundamentally different views of what American national security required. Now, the two personalities I'm speaking of now do not include Clement Attlee. This is MacArthur and Truman. Clement Attlee was an interesting guy, but he was not known for a powerful personality. Winston Churchill, his longtime political foe, said that Clement Attlee is a modest man who has much to be modest about. He was a better politician than Churchill gave him credit for. But nonetheless, he wasn't this dramatic figure. Harry Truman wasn't particularly dramatic, but he was intriguing for the historian because he was very different than most presidents. He was, first of all, one of these accidental presidents. He did not grow up thinking, I'm going to be president one day. Now, in fact, most people who become president don't grow up thinking they're going to be president one day. But those who are going to make a run for the presidency itself, you can start to see that gleam in their eye years before they make their run, because they start to think, I'm more qualified than those idiots who are in office now. Sometimes you can sort of sense that fire in the belly from the time they're young. Just last week, I was speaking at Texas State University in San Marcos, Texas. This is the alma mater of Lyndon Johnson. And so I was walking down the halls, and there's stuff on Lyndon Johnson when he was a student there. And I know enough about Lyndon Johnson, but also I was reminded of it here, that people who knew Lyndon Johnson when he was 19 years old, they knew that this was a guy who was going places. They couldn't tell quite where he was going to go, but he had this ambition. There was something maybe eating at him from inside, something burning inside of him, that made him feel as though his life would not be fulfilled unless he did something really big and grand. Harry Truman wasn't like that at all. Harry Truman was this, well, to use the term of art in the day, he was a political hack. And he worked his way up through the Kansas City machine of Tom Pendergast. And this was kind of the last version of New York's Tammany Hall, where you got ahead by going along. And when the machine was going to give out favors, you were there. And Harry Truman probably had somewhat cleaner hands than other members of the machine. But nonetheless, the fact that he got along with Tom Pendergast meant that he wasn't too fastidious when it came to matters of narrow political principle. And he became he never expected even to be vice president. The only reason he became vice president was the Democratic Party at the National Convention in 1944, when they looked at Franklin Roosevelt and realized this guy might not make it through another 4 years. They revolted against the guy who was the incumbent, Henry Wallace, who is far to the left of most members of the party, especially Southern Democrats. They could not imagine Henry Wallace being president. So we're going to get rid of the president. This is actually an instructive thing, because that was in a time when the political parties got to choose the vice president. The president nowadays, the president just says, I want this person, there you go. That wasn't the case. The political parties, they also had a lot to say about who became the presidential nominee, but they really could insist on who was going to be the vice presidential nominee. So they insisted you got to get rid of Wallace. And Franklin Roosevelt, he didn't attend the convention, but they got him on by telephone. He said, well, okay, get that guy Truman on the line. And he says to Truman, I ought to be vice president. And Truman says, no, I don't want to do this. He didn't want the job. He didn't think he was qualified for the job. But he tried to resist, but Roosevelt was a persuasive guy. And so he becomes vice president. And then he becomes president. And this was one where there are some vice presidents who think they're ready to be president. Well, Lyndon Johnson was vice president, and he was pretty sure he was ready to be president. This is actually one of the reasons that these Kennedy assassination conspiracy theories stick around, because everybody knew that Lyndon Johnson wanted to be president. And what happens when John Kennedy's assassinated? Lyndon Johnson becomes president. But not with Harry Truman. In fact, Harry Truman's first reaction was, oh my gosh. In fact, he went and he spoke to the press the next day. And Truman prided himself on this very good relationship with members of the press, because he liked to think of himself as plain-speaking Harry. And he wouldn't dodge, he wouldn't lie, and if you asked him a question, he'd tell you the answer. But he went to them and he said, boys, he said, I don't know if you ever pray. This is the day after he learns he's president. I don't know if you ever pray, but if you do, pray for me. Because yesterday when I got word, I felt as though the moon, the stars, and everything else fell down upon me. People who woke up on the day after Franklin Roosevelt died and realized that Harry Truman was president thought, oh God, we better pray for the country. So this is the guy. This is one of the guys. Now the other guy was quite different. Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur was one who was born to military command. His father won the Medal of Honor during the Civil War. His son was raised in Army tradition. It was understood that the son would go to the military academy at West Point. He proved to be a brilliant cadet. He was a brilliant guy. He was treated by his father to journeys around the world on the nickel of the Army when the father was military governor of the Philippines. And at a very early age, Douglas MacArthur was introduced to the leaders of East Asia, of Japan, of China, of other Asian countries who would be leading those countries during World War II. He rose quickly through the ranks of the Army as a young brigadier general in World War I. He covered himself with glory. He was undeniably brave. He's one of those generals who led from the front. He disdained to carry arms. He instead walked around with a riding crop. And he had this very long scarf that he wore around his neck, so that when he was on the battlefield, and if there was any breeze, he would sort of stand out in silhouette. And people would see he wore tall riding boots, on the battlefield, walking around like an infantryman. But this was Douglas MacArthur. And people who knew him thought that he was either the most brilliant, the bravest soldier they had ever met, or the biggest ham they had ever run into. And they couldn't quite tell which was which. He knew how to play the Army game, having grown up in the Army, and he continued to advance through the ranks until, in the early 1930s, he achieved the highest rank in the Army, the highest position. He was the Army Chief of Staff. So he was the top military advisor to President Herbert Hoover. And he held that position in the summer of 1932, when, in the midst of the Great Depression, a group of out-of-work World War I vets went to Washington to petition peacefully to Congress to give them an advance on a pension that they had been promised for 1945, when most of them would be reaching about a retirement age. But they pointed out that many of them were in such dire straits that if they didn't get some support now, they probably wouldn't live to 1945 to collect their pension. And they also argued it would be good for the economy to inject some money into the economy. Herbert Hoover said no. Herbert Hoover was an old school guy who believed in balancing the budget. Douglas MacArthur looked at this group and he saw an incipient revolution. He believed that the movement of the bonus army, as it was called, had been infiltrated and taken over by communists, and that they were bent on destroying the American Republic. And so he led the army to bust up the camp of the bonus marchers. It was a debacle. There were injuries. One young girl was killed in this. The tent city of the shanty town of the marchers was torched, and they were scattered to the winds, even though they had nowhere to go. MacArthur treated this as a great victory. Everybody else nearly treated it as, at the very least, a public relations disaster. This is what you're boasting of? A victory over this group? Franklin Roosevelt. This is the summer of 1932. He had just been nominated by the Democratic Party to be candidate for president. And it looked as though the Democrats were going to win, but Roosevelt observed this from a distance and turned to his friend Felix Frankfurter when he got the news of the defeat of the bonus army, what was ironically called the Battle of Anacostia Flat. And he turned to Felix Frankfurter, he said, "Felix, this just elected me." As indeed it did. And he became president. And he inherited Douglas MacArthur as his chief of staff. And MacArthur all of a sudden became Franklin Roosevelt's problem. There's a story that Rex Tugwell, one of Roosevelt's advisors, told about a meeting with Franklin Roosevelt between the time Roosevelt was elected and the time Roosevelt took office. So President-elect Roosevelt is speaking on the phone to Huey Long, the populist senator and governor from Louisiana. And Huey Long was speaking, this is over the phone, but he was speaking in a loud enough voice that Roosevelt held the phone about this far away from his ear. And Tugwell, sitting across the desk, could hear every word that Huey Long was saying. And Huey Long was taking full credit for Roosevelt's victory in 1932 and saying, "Frank, if I hadn't done what I did, you wouldn't be president of the United States." And Roosevelt's just listening and listening. And finally, okay, puts him off and hangs up. And Roosevelt turns to Rex Tugwell and he says, "Boy, that Huey Long, he is the second most dangerous man in America." And Tugwell's kind of curious, but Roosevelt goes on and talks about Huey Long and all the stuff that Huey Long's saying and doing and everything else. And the conversation kind of wanders off until eventually Roosevelt has to turn to something else and Tugwell's getting ready to leave. And he heads out the door, but just as his hand reaches the doorknob, he remembers something. And he turns around and he says, "Governor," because Roosevelt was governor of New York, "Governor, you said that Huey Long's the second most dangerous man in America. Who's the most dangerous man in America?" "Douglas MacArthur." Roosevelt detected in MacArthur something that other people would observe in MacArthur. They might have been wrong, but Roosevelt didn't think so. Harry Truman didn't think so. That there was, well, what shall I say? The mid-1930s, this was the age when authoritarian regimes were taking over from previously democratic regimes. It had happened in Italy. It was happening in Germany. It was going to happen in Spain. And Roosevelt detected in MacArthur, at least thought he detected in MacArthur, this tendency to use the military to solve problems that should have been resolved by political means. So, this is Franklin Roosevelt on Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur is basically exiled by Franklin Roosevelt to the Philippines. He's sent off to the Philippines, where he is going to build up a new Philippine army. The Philippines were a colony of the United States. They were on track for independence, and MacArthur was going to lead the Philippine army, develop the Philippine army, and make sure the Philippines could defend themselves. MacArthur didn't want to go, but Roosevelt sweetened the deal. He said, okay, you can retain your commission in the U.S. Army, you can keep taking your pay in the U.S. Army, and you can accept a commission in the Philippine Army. You can be a field marshal in the Philippine Army. No American officer had ever been a field marshal. This is a higher rank than a general. He got to design his own uniform. And off he went in, and it was this gaudy sharkskin thing. And one of the aides that he took out with him was Dwight Eisenhower. And Dwight Eisenhower, as Eisenhower would tell the story later, he just thought that MacArthur had gone overboard. And when MacArthur said that he was going to become this field marshal in the Philippines, Eisenhower, according to his recollection, says, General, why do you want to be a field marshal for this banana republic? You know, I mean, it wasn't very complimentary to the Philippines, but his point was, you know, you've been a general in the U.S. Army. That's a great office. That's a proud thing. What are you doing by wandering off this other place? But MacArthur was intrigued because MacArthur recognized something in himself, and that was his desire to call the shots. MacArthur didn't yet think that he was going to run for president of the United States. He would, but he wasn't yet there. But he realized that he could be the primary figure in the Philippines. And he goes off to the Philippines, not aware that he would not return to the United States for 16 years. Now, this is crucial to the story. So, anyway, I'm sort of figuring out this story as I'm doing this research in the early 1980s. And I'll sort of fast forward a little bit. And since some of you lived through this time, maybe for the rest of you, I should tell you to cover your ears now while I say this, but it's a spoiler alert. And the story is going to not quite end, but it's going to culminate when Harry Truman decides he has to fire Douglas MacArthur. Okay? This is what happens. And I guess none of you are too shocked. Okay. Because some of you will remember that this had happened. And I was aware as a kid that this had happened. And I began to study it again when I was this graduate student. And the firing has to do with the fact that there is this fundamentally different attitude of the two men toward the basic issues facing the United States. Very quickly, here's the way it goes. The Cold War emerges out of World War II. And the Cold War places the United States in at least tension, competition, and potential conflict with the Soviet Union and its communist allies. And so Harry Truman is the president who is the architect of America's Cold War policy. And it's based on the idea that the United States needs to contain, that was the term that was used, the spread of communism. And Harry Truman in 1947 issued what came to be called the Truman Doctrine, that said that the United States would support those governments threatened by communism. It first applied in Greece and Turkey in a diplomatic way, but it was first applied on the battlefield in Korea. And it came about because Korea had been divided at the end of World War II for convenience sake into a North and South, where Soviet troops would accept the surrender of Japanese forces in the northern region and American troops in the southern region. I was talking about my book in a Washington bookstore called Politics and Prose back in October. And after the event, a gentleman came up who looked vaguely familiar, not familiar in the sense that I thought I had ever met him, but familiar in the sense that I've seen somebody who looks like this guy. And he identified himself as the son of Dean Rusk. Now, Dean Rusk, you will remember, was Secretary of State during the 1960s, sort of the architect, one of the architects of the Vietnam War. And I knew that Dean Rusk had a previous life, a previous career. He had been in the Army during World War II, and it turned out, and actually I knew part of this story, but the details were filled in by his son, who, in the context of Korea, related that his father had been part of an advanced occupation team of American officers in 1945, at the time of the surrender. And they were trying to figure out where the dividing line between the Soviets and the Americans should be for the acceptance of the Japanese surrender. And they got this map out of Korea. And they just looked on the map and they saw that if you have any visual image of the Korean peninsula, it's kind of wide at the top and it gets narrow and then it widens again. And in this narrow part, often called the waist of the peninsula, on this map, it showed there was this line of latitude. And it was the 38th parallel. And they thought, okay, that's about halfway. Let's make the dividing line the 38th parallel. And here are these couple of colonels, and they just said, all right, we'll do it. And that became the dividing line. And in fact, that in essence is the dividing line between North Korea and South Korea today. And here's the son of Dean Russ explaining how this came about. But anyway, so there is this communist North and this anti-communist South. And they remain sort of in competition and tension, but not in conflict for the first 5 years of the Cold War till 1950. And in fact, most people, including President Truman, including Douglas MacArthur, who by this time has segued from being a commander of American forces and Allied forces in the Pacific during World War II, to being the commander of the American occupation of Japan in the period from 1945 till it turns out to 1951. Now, I will stop for a moment to say that one of the reasons MacArthur got into trouble was his belief that he knew what he called the Oriental mind, that he understood Asian culture, the Asian people, what they wanted, what they expected. And it's easy to say, boy, he sure was proud of himself. But as a matter of fact, he had grounds for believing what he believed, even if he exaggerated this. And the grounds are the most astonishing performance by an American in a foreign country ever. And I could argue, in fact, if any of you can think of a counterexample of this, I'd like to hear it. But I cannot think of anybody in all of history who had the power that MacArthur had in Japan as head of the occupation and who accomplished what he accomplished. Japan, when MacArthur got there, was this country that had been run for centuries, for millennia, as an empire that had an emperor who was not simply an emperor, but was a divinity. And it had been effectively run by a military clique for 40 or 50 years. So it was this militaristic, feudal society that revered this empire, this emperor who was divine. MacArthur arrived, and within 5 years, he had remade Japan into a pretty good example of a liberal democracy with voting rights, with rights for organized labor, with rights for women, with rights in advance of rights in the United States. MacArthur was a darling of conservatives generally, but that's because a lot of conservatives didn't know what he had done in Japan. He had really made Japan this model almost of a New Deal kind of society. And it was an astonishing performance, and one of the reasons that he was able to do it was he did understand a lot about what the Japanese wanted, what they needed, what they were willing to tolerate. And it was, as I say, a breathtaking political performance. There possibly has never been an administrator with that kind of power and that kind of successful record. So if MacArthur thought highly of himself, he had reason to think highly of himself. And he was at the height of his powers, almost the culmination of this project in 1950, when suddenly it all was threatened. He was at work on the peace treaty that would restore Japanese sovereignty and send him home. And he was 70 years old. It was time for him to retire. And then, out of the blue, comes this war on the Korean peninsula, when communists in the northern part of the peninsula attack the anti-communist regime in the southern part of the peninsula. And from the perspective of Korea, this was a civil conflict. Neither side, neither North or South, had ever thought of the other side as a different country. And it was just, okay, we're going to restore Korea's unification. But we're going to do it on our terms, the communist terms. This was something that Harry Truman had to respond to. Why? Partly because there is this Truman Doctrine that says the United States will come to the aid of countries that are threatened by communist attack. Partly because he was under political assault for having, and the term was, lost China to communism just the previous year. the Communist Party under Mao Zedong completed its victory in the Chinese Civil War in the autumn of 1949. The attack on South Korea occurred in the spring of 1950. Truman was being pilloried for having lost China to communism. He couldn't afford to lose another country to communism, even one as small as South Korea. And so, Truman orders American troops into battle. He has to do it on an emergency basis because it looked as though South Korea would collapse within days. He couldn't, or at least he thought he couldn't, he didn't want to ask Congress for a declaration of war because Congress was in no mood to give Harry Truman anything he wanted. He had been unexpectedly re-elected in 1948, defeating the Republican candidate Thomas Dewey, and the Republicans, shocked that they had lost this easy election. The shock to the Republicans was, yeah, it was as great as the shock to the Democrats last November. It was an election they could not lose, but they did. And so what the Republicans did was declare all-out political war against Harry Truman. And Truman knew that if he took this war declaration request to Congress, the Republicans would insist on a debate, and the debate would go on for days or weeks, and South Korea would be lost. So on his own hook, he ordered the troops in. The troops, where were they going to come from? Japan, from the occupation force in Japan. And who was going to command them? The U.S. commander in Korea, Douglas MacArthur. So we've got these two guys, Harry Truman and Douglas MacArthur, who are in charge of America's Korean War policy. And at first it looks like, okay, they're both on the same track. MacArthur doesn't want South Korea to follow the communists. He doesn't like communists. He's even more anti-communist than Truman. But this initial cooperation masks a fundamental difference between the two. And that is, first of all, what is the goal? What is the nature of the struggle that we're fighting? And how shall it be done? And even sort of related to this, almost at the bottom of this, is where exactly is the center of this conflict that is being called the Cold War? Is it Asia or is it Europe? To Truman's way of thinking, the Cold War began in Germany. In the division of Germany, Truman had led the country and what at this time was being called the Free World through the Berlin crisis of 1948, the Berlin blockade, the Berlin airlift, and gotten it past that peacefully. He understood that the Cold War would be determined by the future of Europe. And when the problems of Europe were finally solved, then the Cold War would be over. But until then, the Cold War would be on. And that the principal goal, the principal interim goal for a president of the United States was to keep the world from being blown up. Harry Truman had a unique perspective among all of humans who had ever lived on this subject. He's the only person, even until now, who has ordered the use of nuclear weapons against an enemy. He dropped 2 of them on Japan in the end of World War II. And although he said in his memoirs and various other places, he didn't lose any sleep over the decisions. I find that a little bit disturbing. This is a big decision. I hope he lost at least a little sleep. He didn't want to do it again. He didn't want to do it again because he realized it is a horrible thing. Even if it were or is or was necessary, it still was horrible to kill hundreds of thousands of people just boom, like that. But furthermore, it was even more horrible in 1950 because now the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons of its own. So 2 really striking things occur in 1949. One is China goes communist. Number 2, the Soviet Union develops the atom bomb. And so Truman knows that if there is a World War III, World War II ended with the use of nuclear weapons. World War III would begin with the use of nuclear weapons. And this would be a disaster for all of civilization. This is Truman's view. MacArthur's view is, well, basically, Europe is not the center of the Cold War. Asia is. MacArthur had a chronic case of what people in the military and in the diplomatic ranks often call theateritis. He believed that whatever theater he was in charge of or in the middle of was the central theater of activity of the conflict. He was a pain in the neck to George Marshall, who was chief of staff during World War II. He was the foe of Dwight Eisenhower, who was the American commander for Europe during World War II, because MacArthur kept saying, no, the war will be won or lost in the Pacific. Well, he was wrong then, and Truman thought he was wrong again, thinking the central theater of the Cold War was Asia. But he was persuasive, he was outspoken, and he refused to believe that just because the President of the United States said something, that he needed to go along with it. Now, the Constitution of the United States, and I just happen to have a copy in my pocket, courtesy of the Hauenstein Center, and so I'd like you all to take out your copies and turn to Article 2, which says that the President shall be the Commander-in-Chief of American military forces. Okay, that's what the Constitution says. So by the Constitution, Harry Truman outranks Douglas MacArthur. But by nearly every other measure, Douglas MacArthur knew he outranked Harry Truman. After all, Douglas MacArthur was a 5-star general. He was a hero of World War II. What was Harry Truman? Harry Truman had been a captain of artillery in World War I. Captain, that's all the farther he got. He didn't fight in World War II. If you Americans in 1950 were confronted with a decision regarding the use of military power, who are you going to believe? Harry Truman or Douglas MacArthur? Of course you're going to believe Douglas MacArthur. He knows war. And he believed that the Cold War was not simply the Cold War. He believed that the Korean War was the outbreak of World War III. World War II had been all about the United States confronting and defeating fascism. World War III would be about the United States confronting and defeating communism. The Cold War, this was just a warm-up. And once the fighting began in Korea, MacArthur was of the belief that they started it, we're going to end it. And we're going to fight it now. Better to fight it now than later. And so MacArthur welcomed the idea of a larger war, of the Korean War leading to something bigger. Now, he didn't state this in those terms openly, but the actions that he took again and again indicated that he wanted to widen the war. For example, he did say openly that the United States should enlist the forces of Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese nationalists. A brief reminder. The Chinese Civil War pitted Mao Zedong and the communists against Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists. Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists lost, and when they lost, they fled mainland China to Taiwan, or it was usually called Formosa in those days, the Japanese name. And Chiang Kai-shek was itching to reopen the war against the communists, but he needed the support of the United States. He needed an amphibious lift and all this other stuff. And MacArthur was quite willing to do this because MacArthur believed that Chiang Kai-shek would be good allies in this fight against communism. And Truman said, no, we're not going to do that because Truman wanted to keep the Korean War contained. It was all about, again, this policy of containment. The policy of containment said, this is Truman's Cold War policy, we don't want to fight the communists. We want to contain them because communism contains within itself the seeds of its own destruction. And if we can simply prevent the communists from overrunning the world, in time, communism will implode and we will win without having to fight World War III. That's the whole point. We will defeat communism without having to fight World War III. MacArthur believed we will defeat communism only by fighting World War III. They started it. The war has begun. So this is the fundamental split between these two guys. And it played itself out in communications between the command in Korea, except MacArthur's command was not actually based in Korea. Here's a striking thing about MacArthur. And a few of you raised your hands and identified yourselves as veterans of the Korean War. You all have your opinions on this subject. But one of the interesting things about MacArthur is he was one of the most popular generals to come out of World War II. With the American public at large, he had this great reputation in the world, but the soldiers who served under him, at least pretty much everyone that I've encountered, despised him. And they looked on him as a glory hound who claimed credit for all the stuff that they did. They called him Dugout Doug because he didn't come out of his dugout on Corregidor during the Philippines campaign, and it really galled them that when he fled the Philippines for Australia, he got a Medal of Honor. And what did they get? The Bataan Death March. And so there was a lot of bitter feeling toward Douglas MacArthur. But among the public at large, he was this war hero. He was this guy who seemed to know everything. And one thing he really knew how to do was to handle the press. And he was his own press agent. And he would constantly give these speeches. And he was really good at putting his ideas and putting his policies forward, even when they contradicted the policies of the President of the United States. But he understood that he was politically untouchable. That, in fact, he had not come back to the United States since 1935. With one exception, he spent a couple of hours in Honolulu. Hawaii was an American territory, and he had to meet Franklin Roosevelt there during World War II. But except from that, he'd never been back home, despite the fact that Presidents Roosevelt first and then Truman tried to get him to come home. But he knew that they wouldn't order him to come home because they knew that, well, if he ordered them, and this is a question actually that was put to Omar Bradley. Omar Bradley was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff during the Korean War, MacArthur's direct superior. And Matthew Ridgway, who was another Army officer who would eventually succeed MacArthur, was sitting in on a meeting of the Joint Chiefs when they were trying to figure out what to do about MacArthur. And it didn't have to do with this visit to the United States, but it had to do with something else. And Ridgway was puzzled and amazed that the Joint Chiefs refused to give a direct order to MacArthur. Basically, it was clearly the President's desire that MacArthur shut up and stop giving these press conferences at which he contradicted the policy of the President of the United States. And Ridgway said, "What do you mean just instructing him or requesting him? Order him, for God's sake. Why don't you just give him an order?" And Bradley looked at Ridgway and he said, "Because if we did, he might disobey the order. And what would we do then?" And Bradley understood, Truman understood, that this was a case of a general who could overrule the President of the United States and get away with it. And so this is the reason, and this is a central reason, that this difference of opinion was allowed to fester as long as it did. Oh, and then there was the other thing, is that MacArthur was sporadically the most brilliant commander anybody had ever seen. And he turned the tide of the Korean War by ordering this amphibious campaign, an operation. It was a landing at Inchon, which was the port of Seoul, in the middle of the war, that turned the tide of the war. Everybody said you can't do it. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs said you can't do it. It's a crazy idea. Most of MacArthur's subordinates said it'll never work. It's too risky. The problem was that the tides are enormously high and they're fickle, and the amphibious operation would be stranded on the mudflats and be easy pickings for the artillery and everything else. And MacArthur said and believed that precisely because it is so dangerous, it will achieve the critical element of surprise. Inchon has not been reinforced, has not been defended. We will be able to go in and we will do it. And MacArthur went in and did it. And this is MacArthur's story. It's the story of lots of people who begin to think really highly of themselves. The more people say you can't do it, and you do it, the less likely you are to listen to somebody the next time they say you can't do it. I mean, it is the recipe for what the Greeks described as hubris. You can't stop yourself because you think you have an insight, a knowledge, a brilliance that other people don't have. And the more they say no, the less likely you are to listen to them because they have been wrong every time in the past. So why should you listen to them now? So this is the person that Truman is having to deal with. So the Inchon operation turns the tide of the war, and it all of a sudden, far from being driven off the Korean peninsula as it looked like at the beginning, American troops and their South Korean allies, and their Australian and British allies, are in a position where they actually might liberate North Korea. The communists talked about liberating South Korea. What they meant is conquering South Korea. The United States and its allies might conquer North Korea. And this would be a huge feather in Harry Truman's cap, because he'd been accused of losing ground to the communists. Now he's going to win ground back. And Truman could not resist. He could not resist the temptation to give MacArthur his head. Go ahead and win, liberate North Korea. But there's one thing you have to be careful about, and that is do not send American troops right up against the border with China, because China, at this point, began threatening to enter the war. If American troops get close to the war, this is a time when Republicans in Congress, MacArthur himself, Chiang Kai-shek is saying, we're going to reopen the war in China. And if American troops start coming right up next to China, a couple 100,000 American troops, well, it looks like an invasion. Okay, and so they say, the Chinese say indirectly, that if American troops come up with a border, then China's going to have to enter the war. Truman didn't believe him. MacArthur didn't believe him. Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State, didn't believe him, thought they were bluffing. But they decided, okay, well, we're going to have to play a little bit careful. And so MacArthur was given an instruction not to send American troops right up against the border. Not an order, but an instruction. And MacArthur read this as, do whatever the hell you want. And which is basically what he did. I mean, Truman didn't want him to send American troops right up against the border, but Truman was not ordering him not to. And so MacArthur read this as, okay, I will take this on my own responsibility. So he sends the troops up against the border. Meanwhile, MacArthur has this meeting with Truman. Finally, the President of the United States is going to meet his commander for Korea. And he wants MacArthur to come to Washington. That's what generals are supposed to do, but MacArthur continues to refuse. And so Truman decides, all right, I will go out and meet MacArthur. So off he goes. He flies 7,000 miles, takes him 5 days, propeller planes in those days, and to go to Wake Island. And they've arranged this day-long meeting. And MacArthur grudgingly agrees to fly just a few hours from Tokyo to Wake Island to meet his commander-in-chief. And they have this meeting. The meeting is going to last all day. But MacArthur announces before lunch that he's got to get back to work. So the president has come out all of this way, and his general basically stands him up halfway through the meeting. But before he leaves, Truman gets MacArthur's promise that China will not enter the war. Truman puts it point blank to MacArthur. So, General, will the Chinese enter the war, or are they bluffing? And MacArthur says, the Chinese will never dare to enter the war. And if they do, we'll annihilate them. Now, unbeknownst to MacArthur, Truman had a recorder taking down all of this stuff. It was a woman who she wasn't exactly hiding around the corner. By her testimony, she actually thought, she was a stenographer brought along, she was a secretary, and she was going to type up the communique at the end of this. So a couple of secretaries were there. But she expected to be taking a walk along the beach while all this was going on. But the Marine Guards wouldn't let her out, and so she just had to sit down and, okay, well, this is what I'm paid to do, so she took notes. And she had it down that MacArthur says the Chinese will never enter the war, and if they do, they will be annihilated. So, 2 weeks later, the Chinese enter the war. And far from being annihilated, they come close to annihilating the American troops. And this is when Truman has his press conference. And he's asked, so American forces are on the ropes. What are you going to do about it? What weapons are available to American forces? And Truman says, well, and he tries to avoid answering. So he says, all the weapons are available. They always are. And so the reporters say, well, okay, does this mean the atom bomb? And Truman, not wanting to take the atom bomb off the table, he's really not intending to use it, but he doesn't want to take it off the table. He says, yeah, we're considering all weapons. And is this a change in policy? No, we've been considering it from the beginning. We always consider these eventualities. And who will be the one making the decision? Oh, that's the commander in the field. And this is the thing that rocketed across the Atlantic to Clement Attlee and got Clement Attlee to make this rush trip to Washington. So all of this is what I learned when I was doing this research in the early 1980s. And this culminates a couple of months later when Truman decides that enough is enough and MacArthur has to be fired. So he basically sort of takes his political career in his hands and gives the order that MacArthur is going to be relieved, knowing that it is going to destroy his own political career. And it's after this that Truman's public opinion rating plummets. And by Constitution, he could have run for re-election in 1953, but even the Democrats simply wanted him to leave, just get out of town. And he couldn't have gotten the Democratic nomination if he wanted it, and so he announces he's going to leave office. Meanwhile, MacArthur, having been fired, comes back to the United States and receives a hero's welcome. Harry Truman is being burned in effigy, and Douglas MacArthur receives ticker-tape parades and an invitation to give an address, a speech to a joint session of Congress. And this is the one, and this is at the beginning of the age of television. And through the miracle of YouTube, if you want, you can go onto YouTube and you can watch the address. And it is a real knockout of a speech. It's remarkable. The guy, well, so Dwight Eisenhower was sort of asked about MacArthur's ability in situations like this. And were you surprised that MacArthur was able to conduct himself this way and to make his audience cheer when he wanted them to cheer and weep when he wanted to weep? And he says, MacArthur said, no, I'm not surprised. I studied acting under MacArthur for several years in the Philippines. So anyway, so MacArthur goes from there right out onto the political stump. And he announces he's running for President of the United States. Now, he doesn't bother to take off his uniform. He's campaigning as a 5-star general against his commander-in-chief for President of the United States. And he gives one anti-Truman speech after another. And now we come to the final riddle. This is part 3 of my 3-part story. I gave the first part where I learned about it when I was in the 1950s. The second part, what I learned about it in the 1980s when I was studying it. But the third part is what I discovered most recently because, and it follows from something that I couldn't figure out on the basis of what I could see in the 1980s. MacArthur's political campaign for president starts off very promisingly. There, he has this huge following. And if the Republican nomination had been held at the time of his address to Congress in the spring of 1951, they would have nominated him for president by acclamation. He leaves that, and he starts out and he gives a bunch of political speeches around the country. Meanwhile, Congress decides they need to investigate the firing of Douglas MacArthur. So they hold hearings, and MacArthur is invited to come speak, and he does. And he holds forth for 3 days, and he tells all about what a sorry thing it is, what a disgraceful thing it is that this president refuses to allow American forces, American troops to defend themselves by all the means they have possible. America's forces are required to fight the communists with one hand tied behind their back. The communists can go all out. It's the Americans who fight this limited war because President Truman will not allow, for example, the bombing of China itself. Will not allow an invasion of China. Will not allow the Chinese nationalist forces to be summoned on America's side. And this is a disgrace. This will lead to America's defeat in the Cold War. Communism will win. And the members of the combined Senate committees, they listen somewhat respectfully. They ask some questions. And all of this is recorded by, well, not exactly newspaper reporters, but by particular sort of stenographers. And it's not by newspaper reporters per se, because it turned out, and this was often overlooked at the time, overlooked by me at first when I was going through these transcripts, was that these were not actually open hearings. They seemed to be very open because for weeks during the spring of 1951, you could open up the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the LA Times, and see page after page after page after page of this testimony. It would fill up 8 to 10 full pages of these newspapers. It was like the Watergate hearings before television. Okay, but it was printed, and you would read the transcript. And when you read all that stuff, you're pretty convinced you were getting the full story. And you were getting almost the full story. You were getting about 99.5% of the story. But there was a little part you weren't getting. And I didn't realize when I was reading this stuff in the 1980s that I wasn't getting the full story. And so there was a part of the story that I could not figure out. And that is, what happened to MacArthur's political aspirations. His political trial balloon rose very rapidly to the point where some members of the Truman administration thought that MacArthur had deliberately gotten himself fired so that he could come home and launch his campaign for president. And he certainly did. And the campaign for president started off very promisingly. The balloon went up rapidly. But then the balloon, oddly, began losing altitude. And in the 1980s, when I was trying to piece this story together, I could not figure out why. It was just the people who should have been supporting MacArthur, who had been supporting MacArthur, stopped supporting MacArthur. And I had this sense that there was some force operating on my story, on my system. It's just I couldn't see what it was. And I was reminded of the astronomers who discovered the planet Neptune. And some of you will have heard the story. Neptune was discovered after astronomers who were watching the motions of the planets then known, watched them, and the planets weren't going exactly where they were predicted to go on the basis of the planets that were known. There was some kind of outside force that was warping their trajectories, their orbits. And the astronomers inferred from this, there must be another force out there, another gravitational force. Well, that was the impression that I had about the MacArthur story. This balloon flew off course, and I couldn't see the force that was knocking it off course. But I had a sense that there must be something there. So I just left it in the early 1980s. Okay, I just don't know what it is, but there it is. And I just sort of, I guess I wrote it up at that point as that the supporters of MacArthur became disillusioned with MacArthur. But I didn't say why. I didn't know why. And so if you're a historian writing the story, if you don't know why, you just say, there it is, and don't try to explain it because you can't explain it, and hope the readers aren't paying close attention. So anyway, but this was sticking in the back of my head. And years later, so it was 30 years between my first exposure to this and the second exposure. Another 30 years passed. And I'm looking for a book to write. I'm looking for a story after Ronald Reagan. And I had written 6 big biographies. And biographies have their advantages. But one of the problems of biographies is that they focus on a single person. That's the nature of biography. And so you get this sense that the world revolves around your single person. But I know that the world doesn't revolve around single persons. And sometimes there are these stories where at least you want 2 powerful characters. So I remembered this story, Truman and MacArthur. And I thought, I wonder if I could discover that planet that I hadn't seen. I sort of knew existed, but I wonder if there's a way to figure out what the planet was. And I can tell you with great satisfaction that I did. But I think I've run out of time, haven't I? I could say it's all in my book, which is on sale on the lobby.
But you won't get out of here.
Okay. Here's what I discovered. That testimony that amounted to millions of words, literally millions of words, somebody added them up, was not the whole story. I said that it looked as though these were open hearings because they were reported in such comprehensiveness, but not utter comprehensiveness. And in fact, there was a military officer sitting there next to the transcriptionist whose job was to determine what needed to be withheld for reasons of military and national security. And so, after MacArthur spoke his piece, George Marshall, the Secretary of Defense, was invited in. And then Omar Bradley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and Hoyt Vandenberg, the commander of the Air Force, the Air Force Chief of Staff, and the various other staff chiefs. And they came in, and for the most part, they said what they had been saying in public. But on a few rare but significant occasions, Marshall would say, now what I'm about to tell you needs to be off the record. And what he would say was, the thrust of Marshall's remarks, and of Bradley's remarks, and of Vandenberg's remarks, was that General MacArthur is way off base when he says that this limited war that's going on in Korea is peculiarly benefiting the Chinese, the communist side. He said, for example, that when MacArthur claims that the Chinese are fighting all out against American forces, whereas he is forbidden from bombing Chinese bases across the Yalu River in Chinese territory, he's simply not telling the truth. The Chinese are limiting their conflict as well. The Chinese, for example, were not bombing American air bases in South Korea. They were not attacking American positions in Japan at all. And given the fact that America was stretched in Korea, Japan was quite vulnerable. The Chinese, for reasons of their own, had chosen not to widen the war. And what Marshall said, what Bradley confirmed, what Vandenberg and the others added to was that this limited war, if it benefits anybody, it benefits us. Furthermore, and this, by the way, the reason they said that this has to be off the record is they're not going to tell the Chinese and the Soviets how stretched the United States was. Hoyt Vandenberg pointed out that 4/5 of American air power was committed to South Korea, this small country, which means that only 20% was left to cover the rest of American obligations around the world, including Europe. What Marshall and Bradley and the other service chiefs made clear was that the United States could not afford to widen the war. One of the things that Americans overlooked, and again, the Truman administration was not boasting about this, it was doing its best to keep this quiet, was that to a much greater degree than Americans realized, the country had in fact demobilized after World War II and had not remobilized yet. If a world war broke out, the United States might well lose the World War. And furthermore, when MacArthur said, and MacArthur repeatedly said, that he didn't worry about widening the war against China because the Soviets would not enter the war. Well, of course, he had said the Chinese wouldn't enter the war either, and so his credibility was not particularly great. But the other thing was that he was only thinking of his theater. He said the Chinese won't enter the war in East Asia. And he explained why, because it's so far from the centers of Soviet population and all this, and we have the advantage there. Well, that was true enough. But that's not what Truman was worried about. Truman was worried about the Soviets responding not in Korea, but in Germany. Berlin was essentially indefensible. And the United States, because it had so much of its own military power focused in Korea, could not defend Germany. And this again was MacArthur thinking that his theater of the war was the only one that mattered. Or another explanation for this is that MacArthur really did want World War III to commence. It was about this time that MacArthur said, and this is the line that is the second most quoted line of MacArthur. The first most quoted line of MacArthur is the one about old soldiers never die, they just fade away. That's one he borrowed from an old army tune. But the other one that he said is, in war there is no substitute for victory. Boy, and this is the kind of thing that the generation that fought and won World War II can resonate to. World War II was the good war. World War II was the war where, once the war began, the politicians, the diplomats stepped aside, and the generals and the GIs stepped in and they won the war. They claimed victory, and then they stepped off. What Americans didn't realize, what Americans didn't want to acknowledge in the Cold War, and not just in Korea, but right and down until now, is that World War II is unusual among wars. Most wars, the vast majority of wars, are not unlimited wars. The vast majority of wars are limited wars. And the wars, whether you want it to be so or not, are always political. And politics starts the wars, and politics determines what the wars are fought for. There is a strong temptation to say that shouldn't be so. That, you fight the wars, then hand it over to the generals and don't limit what the soldiers can do. Because it means that soldiers are dying, good men are dying, for reasons that have more to do with politics than with something else. But it is in the nature that wars are fought for political reasons. World War II was fought for the political reason of destroying fascism. And the Cold War was fought when it was fought, and it was not fought when it was not fought, for the purposes of opposing communism. Anyway, so what happened, that planet that I hadn't seen back in the 1980s, but that did become available to me because in the interim, the rest of the transcripts of that testimony were declassified. And so by the second go-around, I could see what they had said. I couldn't see it in the 1980s because they were still classified. By the second go-around in the 2010s, they were declassified, and I could see that what Marshall and Bradley and the other witnesses in the Senate hearings told those senators really sobered them up, including the loudest voices on behalf of Douglas MacArthur, the ones who should have been out there cheering for Douglas MacArthur to be the next president of the United States. They realized, oh my gosh, if this guy becomes president of the United States, there's no telling where this is going to end. We could be in World War III and we could lose. And so they didn't give Harry Truman the satisfaction of saying, Mr. President, you were right. No, that's not the way politics works. But what they did do was silently step away from Douglas MacArthur. And he found himself out there all alone. And I use the image of the trial balloon. It's as though the air began to hiss out of the balloon. But another image that I used was when he first came back from the United States, he had this very large following. And everybody was following toward the White House. But then a few of the ones are the leaders, the ones who knew about this stuff in the Senate testimony, they began to realize, you know what? We better look for somebody else. And the person they looked for, and the person they found, was another general. And it was Dwight Eisenhower, who became the President of the United States that Douglas MacArthur thought he should have been. I'll close with one last image. And this was the image that I originally had in mind when I started the project. And I tried to sell this image and this approach to my publisher. And the book was going to be called The Siege of the Waldorf. And it was going to be called The Siege of the Waldorf because when Douglas MacArthur was fired by Harry Truman, he returned to the United States finally. MacArthur had this thing about living in hotels. And he took up residence at the Waldorf in New York. And he spent the remaining 13 years of his life looking down on New York, looking down on the country from his perch in the Waldorf. And increasingly, emotionally, he felt besieged. The world that he had grown up in, the world that, he really was a child of the 19th century. By the 1960s, it was changing beyond recognition. And so he looks out across this world, and here's this old man looking out there, trying to figure out what had happened. And I thought it was a good image. I thought it was a good title. My publisher thought, now let's go with the general versus the president. Anyway, thank you very much. I have tested your patience already. So if you need to leave, I will not be insulted. For those of you who want to ask questions and stick around, I'm more than happy to try to answer questions. MacArthur was married twice, and Harry Truman could not resist writing in his diary that the guy's been married twice. The wife at the time of the Korean War was Jean MacArthur, and she was pretty much a model Army wife, where she went wherever he went. She believed whatever he believed. They had one child together, MacArthur's only child, Arthur MacArthur, named after his father. And Arthur was, I think, 11 or 12 years old at the time that Douglas MacArthur was relieved. And in the photographs of his return, you can see Jean, who is putting on this brave smile. she is as crushed as her husband, maybe more, because he had sort of the self-confidence of believing that he was right and he still might become president. But to her, this was a blow at everything that her husband had stood for. So she was a real MacArthur fan. The boy, Arthur, as I say, he's about 11 or 12 years old. In the photographs, and the photographs maybe don't do justice to any of them because this was in the days when photography, when you stepped off the plane, there's these blinding, flash bulbs that would go off. And here's Arthur MacArthur, and he's just, well, this is pretty neat. Everybody came out to see me. But then he essentially disappeared from public life. And I have to say that I was surprised and a little bit embarrassed to discover, after I wrote the book, that he is still alive. And apparently he is living in the Washington area. And I have heard that he is, I'm not sure officially, but at times he's living under an assumed name because he didn't want to have to deal with MacArthur stuff. MacArthur in the 1950s was about the most famous name in America. And he didn't want to have to grow up under the burden of this. So I say I'm a little bit embarrassed. I was then led to believe that he hasn't done interviews on any of this forever. And so even if I had known of his existence and tried to ask, he would have said no. And that would be fine. I'm not going to disrupt somebody's privacy. If they don't want to talk, they don't want to talk. But that's sort of the story. There's nothing sort of remarkable about the family except that that Arthur MacArthur's upbringing was rather strange in that he spent his first 10, 11 years away from America. He returns to this country of which he is a citizen and a national, but of which he knows nothing. And he's trying to figure out why his father, whom everybody so almost revered in all the places where he was. MacArthur had this habit of surrounding himself with sycophants, with people who told him that he was the smartest guy in the world, the most principled person in the world. And these were Arthur MacArthur's playmates, because there weren't none of the kids around. And then to come back and discover that, wait, people don't like Dad? So that was a bit of a shock. But so that's sort of the MacArthur family story. Now, the Truman and Bess Truman, this is a great story because, it's a great story in the sense that it is this long-running love affair and where Harry Truman was pretty sure that he was not good enough for Bess Truman. And Bess was pretty sure of the same thing. And Bess's parents were absolutely convinced of that. But nonetheless, he woos her, and he is astonished at his good fortune that she says yes. And some people might be a little bit horrified at the analogy that I'm about to make. Others might be gratified. But there is an aspect of Harry Truman that is echoed in Donald Trump. And it was this: a very strong protective streak toward members of his family. And in particular, his daughter, Margaret, was trying to make a career as a writer and as a singer. And when she got a bad review, Truman, this really sounds Trumpian, Truman threatened to punch the lights out of the person who gave his daughter a bad review. And part of you wants to shudder at this. Come on, you're president of the United States. But I've got a daughter. I have a couple of sons. I see where he's coming from. I can understand why people responded to Harry Truman. Oh, one last thing I need to say about Harry Truman. And that is, he left office in 1953 the most unpopular president in American history. These days, the Hauenstein Center and people who frequent it, scholars of the presidency, rank Harry Truman as one of the 4, 5, or 6 greatest presidents. What happened? History proved Harry Truman right. I told you about that containment policy and how the philosophy was we don't have to fight World War III to win it. We simply have to contain the Soviet Union, and communism will collapse in the Soviet Union under its own weight. Truman's reputation remained in the basement through the 1950s. It came up slightly in the 1960s when Americans discovered that the draw in Korea, which was very unsatisfactory in the 1950s, was actually pretty good by comparison with what was happening in Vietnam. In 1953, the outcome in Korea looked like a sad comparison against the outcome of World War II. But by 1969, Lyndon Johnson would have given his right arm to get a Korea outcome in Vietnam. So it turned out that there were worse outcomes than Korea. And furthermore, when South Korea thrived and became this model of, well, sometimes rambunctious democracy, but nonetheless this democratic capitalist success story. But the real ascent, the real resurrection of Harry Truman's reputation came with the end of the Cold War, when in fact the scenario that Truman had predicted in 1945 and 6 and 7 played out in 1989, 90, and 91. And the United States, the American side, the free world, won the Cold War on Harry Truman's terms. So history finally came around to Harry Truman's way of thinking, so that any president who leaves office under a cloud hopes that there will be a Harry Truman effect. George W. Bush is waiting in Crawford, Texas.
Another bravura performance from Bill Brands. The book's on sale out there in the lobby. He's going to be signing your books, and just enjoy talking to him some more out there. Thanks so much for coming this evening. Thank you.